Hello, my Meerkat chums, and welcome back to Meerkat Musings. I'm your host, Ben, with some Formula One thoughts for you this afternoon as we gear up for F1's summer break. There is one more race to go, round 14, at the iconic Belgian Grand Prix held at Spa, and then the teams are actually required to take a break. Everything kind of shuts down, perhaps beyond some minor administrative stuff. Everything else, all the major admin stuff, all the mechanical work and that kind of thing is meant to kind of stop for a while. It probably still quietly, secretly bubbles away under the surface. Formula One is never truly static, but the official rule is that everyone kind of downs tools, which, to be fair, makes sense. I mean, everyone needs a breather in this very long 24-race season. So, with this final race before the break coming up, Formula One finds itself in an interesting place because what we have presently is a Max Verstappen who has clearly been showing signs of strain and stress lately. His radio calls at Hungary were nothing short of very angry, maybe with some justification. To be fair, he twice found himself behind the Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton as a result of pit stop strategy, and there's no guarantees that he would have caught up with the McLarens if he got past Hamilton, but nonetheless he was stuck behind Mercedes on more than one occasion. It cost him time. He couldn't find a way past on the track, and he was getting clearly frustrated on the team radio, to the point where actually his engineer more or less told him to shut up. The precise words were something along the lines of not having a slanging match with other teams over the radio, and suggesting that Max was actually being childish, which is quite a big slapdown of a driver, especially the reigning three-time world champion, no less. But I can understand the team's perspective. Max expressed some dissatisfaction, among other things, with the car, as well as the strategy. And I think the team is probably feeling a bit miffed, as I would be, bearing in mind that Red Bull have delivered to Max Verstappen a championship-winning car for 3 years in a row. And the last 2 years, and especially last year, a car able to do that in a fair degree of comfort. And, for the first 5 or 6 races of this season, Max enjoyed some fairly routine Sunday drives. It's fair to be said. And all of that, you have to wonder, has possibly led Verstappen to feel too comfortable up front. He hasn't really been challenged by anybody until we've entered into the middle phase of this season. And all of a sudden, there's a bunch of people that have challenged Max and Red Bull. And on top of all of that, there's a bit of dissatisfaction there with, I think, how some of the upgrades have gone with the Red Bull. Red Bull actually brought some upgrades to the Hungarian Grand Prix, and yet they still couldn't quite find the pace they wanted. It was a front row lockout for McLaren for the first time in many, many years at the Hungaroring, and Max wasn't far away. Don't get me wrong, he remains, of course, an extraordinarily talented racing driver, and the Red Bulls remain, in my view, very, very good cars. But they're not now, of course, dominating races from start to finish. Max has had it very, very easy, particularly sort of last season, as I say. And there is that possibility that he has gotten complacent, that perhaps Red Bull have gotten a bit complacent. And between that trait and between the behind-the-scenes aggro at Red Bull, and behind the news that Adrian Newey, of course, is moving on, have the wheels come off slightly? Because you've got a driver who is making some very public, very angry noises in the form of Max Verstappen. In the case of Sergio Perez, it's a whole different problem. Perez, I like the guy, and I've actually defended him quite stoutly in the past on web forums, but he's clearly kind of lost his resolve and is costing the team quite dearly. So with all of that, Red Bull, who've looked kind of invincible these past couple of years, all of a sudden unravelling a little bit, which will be of concern, of course, to everyone associated with the team, including Helmut Marko and Christian Horner, of course, and especially for someone in the form of Max Verstappen, who is highly driven and highly motivated, and the whole thing probably needs a long, hard, serious look at, with some probably uncomfortable discussions for a lot of people over the summer break. And one of those uncomfortable discussions has to be aimed at Max Verstappen. He has made a few errors of judgment this season on the track, and that has perhaps cost him in certain places. He made a mistake in Miami, which cost him the win there. He is arguably at fault for the incident that saw him and Lando Norris lose out on a potential win in Austria. He is, again, arguably at fault for the collision he had with Lewis Hamilton in Hungary that saw Verstappen lose a place there as well. And this is perhaps a symptom of something that, when you look at the course of Verstappen's racing, you'll see he can be extremely aggressive, both when he's defending and attacking for places. There's been talk a lot about how he was complaining how he was pushed off the track at the start at Hungary, but there's a lot of footage out there of Verstappen himself, getting his elbows out, very aggressively holding the line and forcing other drivers off the track. So it is an interesting case in perhaps a measure of hypocrisy in many respects, and someone needs to kind of probably somehow gently encourage Max to maybe tone it down a little bit. If you're going to win things in Formula One, you have to have a bit of aggression. Absolutely, of course you do. But you also need to show a bit of patience as well. Verstappen was driving very angrily in Hungary, and he was clearly impatient. He was rattled, and it showed. And consequently, he made another mistake, which cost him points. Now, he still has a margin of nearly 3 race wins between himself and second place Lando Norris. So the ball is still very much in the court of Max Verstappen and Red Bull, at least in terms of the Drivers' Championship. In terms of the Constructors' Championship, that's actually a different ball game, because Perez is costing the team so many points that McLaren are in with a real shout of winning the Constructors' title. Both Norris and Oscar Piastri are putting together some good performances. The car, there's an argument that McLaren actually have the fastest car on the grid right now. So there's a serious challenge there for the Constructors' Championship, unless Perez can improve. And sometimes I wonder if he's kind of mentally checked out already. So who knows where that's going to go. And the other problem that Max Verstappen has, of course, is with a teammate that's so far out of the picture, there's no chance for Red Bull to kind of play around with strategy and double team their opponents. If anything, Verstappen would have been vulnerable potentially to a split strategy from McLaren if he had managed to stay in touch with them, which he actually couldn't. So plenty of reasons for Max to perhaps be frustrated, and understandably so, but equally the way in which he's responding to this is not helping his own cause. there was one suggestion, I have no idea if it's true, that he was apparently staying up quite late until like 3 a.m. the night before the race, playing racing simulators. Now, that's not the best preparation ahead of a Formula One Grand Prix. So, if that's the attitude Max has taken, and I don't know if that's true, as I say, but if that is the attitude he's taken, then it's wholly the wrong attitude for someone that wants to be competing at the top level of a very demanding and very grueling motorsport. Whereas I think Lando Norris, for example, he has been approaching his races with a very kind of regimented system, and you can kind of guarantee that the likes of Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, and in the past champions like Sebastian Vettel and others, they wouldn't dream of that kind of almost flippant attitude in their preparation for a Grand Prix. It would never occur to them to do that. So if that's true, then it's a wider element of some pretty serious attitude problems for Max Verstappen, woven into a deeper, troubling tapestry at Red Bull. So the biggest stumbling block, perhaps, to a fourth consecutive World Championship for Verstappen might be himself and his own team, which would have been inconceivable after the first 5 races of the season. As I say, the biggest challenges right now are McLaren, and Lando Norris followed home Oscar Piastri for a 1-2 finish in Hungary. That was not without controversy of its own. At the first round of pit stops, McLaren made the decision to pit Norris first, even though Norris was running in second. Norris qualified pole, lost the lead at the start to Piastri, and subsequently Piastri began to open up a reasonable gap, and that gap did kind of shrink a bit, and Norris did gain some ground because he was able to pit first. He was pitted first because of concerns about the chasing pack, but nonetheless he kind of got the opportunity to pit first. Normally the lead driver of a team, barring an important strategical element, will stop first. In this case, as I say, Norris stopped first, and then he was pitted first a second time, despite still running in second. And at this point, he was actually closer to Piastri, and consequently, when Piastri pitted, Norris was in front. Now, what the team had already informed Piastri of, and I believe they'd already informed Norris of this as well, was that they wanted to maintain the previous running order. In their view, it was the fair thing to do was for Norris to give the lead back to Piastri. You can discuss that kind of decision long into the night. There's an argument to be made that Norris could have gone on to win the race quite comfortably. He was quicker in that kind of final stint than Piastri, and he, for a number of laps, seemed very, very reluctant to give the place back to McLaren, to Piastri. And McLaren were not being particularly decisive about the decision either. They were kind of pleading with Norris, appealing to his kind of like kind team player nature a little bit. And Norris was probably thinking, well, hang on a minute, I've inherited the lead. My teammate is not catching me. If anything, he's going a little bit further behind. And I want to be potentially challenging for the title. I'm closer in the standings to Verstappen. A win would be a lifeline. But in the end, Norris did relent, and he did give the place back to Piastri, who took his first Formula One win. Some are suggesting that win was tainted a bit by the way in which it came around, and I do kind of agree. It's a bit unfortunate that it happened in the way that it did. If Norris had given back the lead sooner, without some of the theatrics and arguments over the radio, perhaps it wouldn't feel quite that way. But nonetheless, you can argue in that opening phase of the race that Norris didn't really deserve to win, and Piastri did. And in fact, Norris went as far as to say that in post-race comments. So in the end, he did the right thing, and now we have another new, I might add, race winner in 2024. We've had wins, of course, for Verstappen. We've had both the Ferrari drivers, and we've had both the McLaren drivers and both the Mercedes drivers take race wins. So we've had 7 different winners in Formula One in 2024. It's kind of unlikely we're going to see Perez make that top step, but you never know. But for McLaren, great things are underway, and they'll be hoping at a track where being fast can be very important, that they can have a good result in Belgium. Another team hoping perhaps for a good result would also happen to be Mercedes. They were fortunate in one sense with George Russell's win in Austria, but that win did demonstrate that the car had improved. They put themselves into the pocket to potentially sort of pick up the pieces if there was a problem, and they did. In Silverstone, it was a combination of the car really coming alive and some good strategy from Mercedes, some botched strategy from McLaren that ensured Hamilton's kind of famous 104th win, which is just amazing. It's 104 wins. At Hungary, Hamilton took his 200th podium. So he's had 200 trips to the podium, and more than half of those are wins, which is just surreal. I mean, some drivers don't compete in 200 races, let alone appear on the podium 200 times. And it was fair to say that Hamilton's defence was quite robust and, in my view, quite brilliant against the Verstappen in a car that was, in my view, superior at Hungary. So Hamilton's reminded us that he's not a spent force by any means, even though I remain dubious as to whether Ferrari can give him a title-winning car. Speaking of Ferrari, they have kind of done the opposite of Mercedes. Whereas Mercedes have been improving their car through their upgrades, Ferrari, if anything, have made theirs slightly worse. They have picked up a couple of wins. Sainz's win in Australia, was the result of a technical problem for Verstappen. Leclerc's win in Monaco was the result of the Ferrari being the best car on the grid at Monaco. The nature of the setup and the car and the track suited Ferrari quite well. Didn't suit the Red Bulls at all, as we know. But since then, they've gone kind of backwards. They had a miserable race in Canada, and they've not really properly picked up the pieces from there. I mean, 4th and 6th in Hungary, it wasn't a terrible day for them at the office, but they weren't troubled at all by the second Mercedes of George Russell, who had a terrible experience in qualifying, and they didn't face much difficulty from the second Red Bull, Sergio Perez, because he also had a terrible qualifying. And so they weren't necessarily, it wasn't necessarily a true reflection of where they were going to be. So they need to address how their upgrades have actually hampered the car's performance. It's not as quick as it was. We had this this genuine feeling that Ferrari were turning a corner and becoming more of a threat to Red Bull, but they've, as I say, they've kind of dropped off that a little bit. Elsewhere, outside of the top 4 teams, we have the usual kind of scramble and squabble for position. Aston Martin really went downhill in 2023. They've not recovered from that. There was a feeling at one point, especially in the earlier parts of 2022 and 2023, that Aston Martin was starting to come together and putting together a car that could consistently challenge for podiums. But since then, they have gone quite backwards. And it's a shame, because there's no question that Fernando Alonso does great things in pretty much any car that he's got, but even his immense experience and skill cannot overcome a car which is fundamentally not quick enough. And that just so happens to be the Aston Martin. They are picking up points as a team, but they're squabbling over the lower end of points, and they would really love to be pushing on and doing a bit better. They're slightly embroiled in a bit of a fight with the Haas team, with Kevin Magnussen, who's on his way out, of course, and Nico Hülkenberg trying to make the most of what they've got. You've got the Alpine duo of Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly, who, again, don't really have the machinery to go very far. They've had a poor season, Alpine. When you consider in their guise as Renault a few years earlier, they were actually winning races, well, very occasionally. When you consider actually that as Alpine, Ocon won the 2021 Hungarian Grand Prix, albeit through a number of sort of fortunate processes, they haven't really pushed on at all. And they've had some inter-team issues as well. I don't think it's fair to say that all of the collisions Esteban Ocon has had with his teammates down the years have been his fault, but he does seem to be the common denominator time and time and time again. He had issues with Sergio Perez when they were together at Force India. He had one or two issues with Alonso at Alpine, and he's had one or two issues with Pierre Gasly at Alpine. It is said actually that Ocon and Gasly do not like each other. They had a few issues when they were coming up through the junior categories where they clashed a few times, and although they don't have like an incendiary relationship, they are not particularly warm to each other either. So I did wonder when they made that pairing how that might impact the team. And we saw, not for the first time, how Ocon simply will not yield for teammates. And we saw that in spectacular fashion in Monaco, where Ocon made a somewhat rash move on Gasly at the start, but ended up putting himself out of the race when he kind of bumped over Gasly's car. So disappointing elements there for Ocon. He does not have a contract for next year, so who knows where he will end up. He, like Kevin Magnussen, without a drive potentially, and it could be the case that Daniel Ricciardo could be without a drive next season as well. There's speculation abound as to whether or not one of the Racing Bull drivers, Ricciardo or Yuki Tsunoda, might inherit a position at Red Bull. Although there's a young lad by the name of Larson, whose name has been, whose name has been floated as someone to kind of step in. He's another young Australian driver. As it happens, there's been talk about him stepping into the Racing Bulls, actually, possibly even replacing Ricciardo after the Belgian Grand Prix. Who knows with that one? But it doesn't seem likely that Ricciardo will get back into the Red Bulls, regardless of what Perez is doing. If Red Bull are going to promote someone forward, it would be Yuki Tsunoda, but they might not necessarily feel Tsunoda's done enough either. Although there are limits to what you can do in the Racing Bull. It's always, whether it's been Toro Rosso or AlphaTauri and now Racing Bull, that team has always been the B team to the main Red Bull team. They don't have the same resources or experience available to produce the cars that they kind of want and need to be competitive. They're really not likely to be a challenge. anytime soon, and that's a little bit unfair perhaps on the drivers because they cannot showcase what they can do with the car that they've got, apart from scrapping for the odd points here and there. But nonetheless, you can get a bearing perhaps for what they are capable of to a degree, and the question becomes, who's generally speaking quicker than their teammate? And so far this season, Tsunoda has been quicker than Ricciardo. There's no two ways around that. Elsewhere on the grid, you've got the Williams team, who've picked up a handful of points thanks to Alexander Albon. It's fair to say that Logan Sargent hasn't particularly impressed, and who knows what his long-term F1 future will be. The Saubers have been quite simply diabolical. Gorianzu and Valtteri Bottas are, basically they don't have a car behind them that is able to do very much of anything. That's simply the reality for those two. They're a slow team. It's not the fault of the drivers, but it's a very slow team, and they are simply going absolutely nowhere. Nowhere fast at all. It doesn't as well help my viewpoint of the team that the cars themselves, with their kind of bright neon green livery, look absolutely hideous. That's very much a personal, subjective view there, but I look at their cars and I can't look at them because they are ugly. I don't know what compelled them to go with what has to be possibly the worst livery that any team in Formula One has ever produced. It's an eyesore, to put it mildly. But, leaving that aside, that's the picture of the season thus far, really. What we have thus far, when we look at the overall standings, it's still very much something where Verstappen is in the driver's seat for the title, without a doubt. I believe he will still be world champion. I think as much as the Red Bulls have been caught by McLaren, certainly, and with other teams kind of sniffing around, I do believe that they will prove to be the team to beat, or at least Verstappen will prove to be the car to beat. He'll win more races this season. I don't doubt that. But I think there are more wins, certainly for McLaren this season. I don't know if we can say there are definitely more wins for Mercedes, but I think they have more of an opportunity for the odd win here and there than Ferrari do. But we'll get to Belgium. We'll see how things play out on that iconic track where you kind of have to grapple with the balance of the car, because Belgium, you've got some incredibly fast sections where you want low downforce. You've got a very windy and twisty middle sector where you want higher downforce. So as always, a challenging track from the point of view of setup. Whose car is best equipped to handle that track? Will Verstappen snap out of this kind of grumpy, almost entitled mindset that he's had? Will the team take a stronger view with him that you kind of feel they possibly need to? Verstappen is not the team, and I think someone at Red Bull needs to remember that and step up and put their foot down a bit with him. Who knows? We can but wait and see. We'll enjoy the Belgian Grand Prix this weekend, and from there we'll brace ourselves for a possibly dramatic final segment of races.